Do you feel like you're stuck in the job doldrums? We all know work can be better. If you believe there's a better way to work, join us in the global Work Forward movement now. Welcome to the Work Forward podcast.
Welcome to the Work Forward podcast. Look, we all know this. Work can be better. Work Forward's not a company. We are a movement and a community of people through all walks of life that believe work can be much, much better. Look, here's the deal. Our daily goals and routines are painfully obvious and they're frustrating. We sit in unproductive meetings. We sit in needless obstacles that prevent us from actually moving forward with our work. And this is why we actually formed Work Forward. And this is the podcast to talk about work. What's up, y'all? I am Natalie Bourne. I'm an innovation facilitator, and I'm going to be joined today by three incredible people that are going to introduce themselves right now.
Awesome.
Hey everyone, I'm Jeremy Verrill-Hobb. I'm the lead strategist and a senior designer at Territory.
Cool.
I'm Suzanne Flaum. I'm also a strategist and a facilitator at Territory.
Awesome.
I'm Sunny Brown, and I'm also a facilitator. I call myself a game facilitator, and I'm currently focused on collaboration as a deep skill.
Love that.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we have a really cool story that we're going to talk about today. If you've been listening along with us on the Work Forward podcast, you know this. We love to open with a story. So Jeremy's going to take it away.
Yeah, so in the second episode of our podcast, the last one that we recorded, we talked a lot about selling by fear and greed, and it's kind of at the corporate level, how the drive to keep stock high and to hit growth goals every quarter can really hurt a business in the long term, and maybe more importantly, hurt the culture surrounding the business, both internally and externally. And that conversation made me think about a kind of workplace fear that's much closer to home for me. A million years ago, and it really was about a million years ago when I first started working, I worked for a pretty terrible supervisor. None of us were clear on what would make him happy, and he was unhappy pretty often. That randomness, the inability to understand what success looked like was terrible.
Yeah.
It changed the way we cared ourselves at the office. And I think that you probably all have experienced this. Mostly it just squashed any innovation or creativity. Everyone kept their head down. Everyone was busy protecting themselves from his wrath. And that made it impossible to collaborate, to improve, to do the kinds of things that actually move work forward. And, it's been a long time since then. And I work in companies that have the opposite kind of experience as well, where joy is kind of the centerpiece of what the work itself actually is. But I'll never forget. I mean, I still carry a piece of that with me. And there are moments in my working life when I still feel a little bit of that. Something will happen and it will trigger a thing in me. And there's like a fight or flight response. Like, am I going to be okay? And so my first question for the three of you is, have you had an experience like this? And if you have, what was it like? What'd you learn?
It sounds like an alcoholic parent. I mean, just to break that down, when you don't know what the expectations are and someone can switch on a dime, then you're walking around on quicksand. So I'm just acknowledging that that's not only a work problem, that's just a tribal, familial, cultural, human problem.
That's real. Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
that's real. I mean, anywhere where anger abounds or abuse abounds, it's you feel that need to walk on eggshells. I had a situation where I mean, I've had some amazing bosses in my life, and I've had some really rough ones. I can remember one in particular. We will not name the name of the company.
God, I kind of want you to.
I know, right?
Just so we can help them.
Warning.
Let's help them.
But what was so interesting about that experience was it was very triggering. You hate it coming to work because you didn't know if they were going to throw you under the bus. You didn't know what side of this, the situation you were going to get. And so it was one of those things where you realized that their insecurities became something that leaked onto you.
Yeah.
And then you were now having to carry that in addition to your workload. And so there is something there, I think, Jeremy, as you were talking about that story, where when leaders don't develop themselves and when they don't really press into their own issues and insecurities and get them solved, that leaks onto the rest of the organization, and it creates chaos, and it creates an untenable work situation.
That's so right.
And it's so hard as the recipient, we'll say, victim in some cases, to actually have the presence in a workplace, especially where we think that we have some sort of boundaries of behavior, to then realize, oh, wow, I'm actually receiving abuse, like you described, something like an abusive personal relationship where
Yeah.
in some ways we're actually like a little bit more trained to know like this is something that can happen. Alcoholism is a thing, but we
Mhm.
assume that that gets checked at the door, but it never,
Yeah. I call it
Right.
junk, but yeah, all your junk could
Yeah.
just comes with you. Yeah.
So then as an employee, like, whew, wow, to be able, there's a lot of tools for mindfulness and presence that we could bring
Mhm.
to that scenario. And ultimately it is an abusive relationship.
Yeah, that's what sort of I'm not seeing that in the context I'm in, but I'm seeing that where people have power to influence what. And that in itself is fundamentally a question that's important, right? Because even if you have that skill set and that training, and you understand, even if you have boundaries and you have clarity around what you're witnessing and you're not being gaslit to the point where you're doubting your own reality and so forth, you still have a power dynamic that you may or may not feel like you can navigate. So I've been external on purpose forever because I don't want to skirt that stuff, and so now for the first time I'm experiencing like organizational, in a meaningful way, organizational dynamics as more of an insider, and I find myself feeling really protective of people, and I find myself wanting to train them in how to take care of themselves, and also acknowledging where they don't actually have influence and power, and like, what the hell, I mean, what do you do with that? So it's just an interesting inquiry, an important one.
Yeah. I mean, how much of this, you guys have both danced around it, but let's like put the elephant in the middle of the floor and paint it red. This
Mhm.
idea of power distance, like how does that actually show up at work? And how does that actually impact us as leaders or people that are being led? Like that's a real thing that you guys are dancing around, but how does it actually flex its muscles in the way that we show up to work when there's this massive power distance between us and our boss? And then on top of that, they're treating us a certain way.
Mm. Mhm. So I could just lean in a little bit. Like, I don't know the language power distance, but I think I get the concept. So there's a training called Right Use of Power that I was trained in, but also am very much still activating. And so partly the responsibility is on the leadership that they need to understand that there is a power differential and that they are also in that relationship with you. So when they're oblivious to that, or when they are abusive of it, or when they conveniently change how they approach it, that's fundamentally disruptive for the person who's in what they call in that training the down power position. And so I don't have the answers, but I think the question has got to be asked for a whole lot of reasons. And I also think there's times when when you have to recognize that a system is not only dysfunctional, it is in fact pathological. And for me, once I recognize that the system I'm in is not receptive to information or change, then I won't stay. And that's a luxury that I have because, again, like there's certain sort of places that I protected myself as an entrepreneur because I'm not an internal person. So I'm also really curious about what y'all have seen, how people do protect themselves or take care of themselves when there's not an exit strategy, or when there's not a system flex. The system can't flex,
Yeah, I was thinking about that in a personal experience as well. I've mostly been external,
Yeah.
but all of my career sort of for similar reasons,
Right.
maybe subconsciously.
Yeah, you don't want to be
but-
trapped,
Yeah, it's probably some deep-seated, past life, whatever.
Same.
We can unpack that in another one. But I was remembering that one of the lessons for me was when people show you who they are, trust that they have. And
Recognize it's a
especially
pattern.
once it happens a few times, it's not going to change. And for me personally, I've had to learn to quit faster. Quitting's not an option for everybody. So to that
That's
point,
right.
I think it's about allyship, finding the allies, finding the informal ombudsman inside the organization for sort of the emotional support. It might not change things tactically, but to be able, just like you would in a personal relationship, if you were feeling attacked, you would fortify yourself to manage that. And honestly, I would start updating your LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, if it's pathological, which I agree, it's very common, right? Culture flows down from the top often.
Yes.
And if you're not in the, how did you describe, I love that language you use, power, down power versus, was it
Yeah.
up power or
Yeah.
top power?
Mhm.
Yeah. If you recognize you're in a down power position,
Mhm.
just assessing that quickly, I think, and being really honest
Yes.
about it. But then also assessing I like the language of spheres of control, right? Like
Mhm.
I do have control over my day-to-day, over my emotional health, over the people that I do interact with.
Mhm.
Let's make sure that that's really strong. And
Mhm.
then do I have another layer out that I have influence over? Is there anyone else that I can
Mm.
pull into my situation for the benefit of myself and others? But then recognizing where that sphere of influence ends and
Mhm. And
potentially
what
it
your
does mean.
tolerance threshold is,
Mm.
because some
Yeah.
people are much more sensitive to kind of egregious behavior, and other people it kind of rolls off them. I wish I were the latter. I'm so sensitive, so I'm not that person. But Jeremy, you were going to say something, because I feel like this is connecting back to your story.
Mm.
Well, there's just a couple of things that I heard from y'all that I want to reflect on that I think are important to keep in mind, and a little bit of, I mean, I'm glad that we're in a space where we're talking about sort of the emotional state that we're in from this, because it is such an emotional experience to be in those difficult spaces, particularly when you're down power.
Mhm.
But there's a couple things that I think are important. One of them is, Sunny, you talked about sort of understanding the power structures of the place where you are, and I think that's a thing that's a learned skill. That's a thing that you can, there are ways you can learn how to do that, so that you can start to map action. And the second thing I want to talk about is influence versus power. And Suzanne, you talked about that a little bit as well. And so I want to dig into that a little bit also. And I think understanding both influence and power structures, and just having that picture is very often enough enlightenment to sort of know this is unchangeable. This is a thing that can be changed. There's the one person that's creating this chaos for the rest of us. It's bleeding into our space. It's coming from the top down, so it'll never change in this organization, because that person, this organization is run by and owned by this person. And that kind of understanding, I think, is a pretty important. And it's one of the, I want to grab onto some pragmatic handles in this space because it's so hard. And that's one of them, is like, just understand. But the other thing, that word influence is so important to me. And I've worked with a lot of people who are power hungry.
Yeah.
And when I have chances to mentor those people, or just being and mentoring, sometimes peer-to-peer mentoring, where I'm also receiving from them. I'm not thinking of myself as above them, but when I have a chance to sort of speak into those people's lives, one of the things I'll tell them always is cultivate influence. Don't worry much less about power. And power matters, because power can be kind of a gatekeeper on and off switch, but organizations move on influence, and change happens because of influence. And there are, in almost every organization where I work, there are people in that organization who have very little power and significant amounts of influence. And those are the people that I always feel like I want to sort of sidle up to and become close to, because I want to understand how they did that. And I also know that if I want to pull a lever to see a change happen in a place, they might be the first person that I go to initiate that kind of change, right?
Oh, that's really what you're saying about initiating the change is, I think, an important factor. And so let's say we can't quit. Not everybody has the luxury of just walking out. I know at one time in my life, I was a single mom, so I couldn't just quit, right? It was like, it was all on me. So I remember in this season having some really hard conversations. I once had a boss ask me to lie. We literally got on a phone call with another group in the organization. We talked through this change. They said, absolutely, we need you to stand down. This is what's going to happen. This is the way we need it to happen. Here are all the reasons why. She said, yes, 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 yes. Hung up the phone, looked at me and said, you'll go around him. And it was one of those things where I was reporting, like, she was my boss's boss. So she was pretty far up the chain. She'd been there for years. It was one of those things where I'd just gotten there. I'd been on the scene 6 months. She's there, 10, 15 years. And it was clear that, how was I going to kind of go toe to toe with that? So it was one of those things where I left that room, and I went home that night and was like, this isn't me. Like, even if I get fired, this isn't me. So I went back the next day. I went to my boss, which was not her. She was my boss's boss. And I said, hey, I need to talk to you about something I'm really concerned about. And he started laughing. He said, are you saying she asked you to lie? Like, almost like he didn't believe it. And I straight faced was like, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And he's like, oh, like, it was that moment of like, okay, this isn't a joke. You're coming to me because you're concerned. And he confronted her on it. And her behavior towards me got worse. And
Yeah.
eventually I ended up leaving. But it was one of those kind of stake in the ground moments of like, I can either continue to have a really bad experience here and do some things that are going to make me feel super shady about myself later, or we can do the hard conversation now. And ultimately that's probably going to lead to your exit, but it would be better than not being able to sleep at night.
See, but that's because you have an ethical compass, apparently. And that's not true for everybody. You know what I mean? Like, to Jeremy's point, there's the power hungry, and I know you like pragmatic, so I was going to just add, there's like in the right use of power training, there's role power, there's status power, and there's personal power, and those things are very different. But the power hungry don't always have an ethical compass that they even use to gauge whether or not their behavior will even impact their perception of themselves. And this is a whole other philosophical conversation I know we don't have time for, but I think there's something important to be asked. And I think, Jeremy, your story was pointing to it, which is that, are these systems fundamentally unethical? Like, these systems of organizational capitalistic systems, are they fundamentally unethical by virtue of what they value? I'm like seriously sitting with that question, because I'm not internal. So I'm like so many learning curves, and I'm looking at it. I'm like, can I even be an ethical practitioner in this kind of system? I don't actually know, and
in the right system, I think you can, but I think you're leaning into a very difficult argument here, which is, how do we know from the outside looking in which of these systems desire to be ethical and which ones don't?
Totally.
And sometimes it's only when you get in the bowels of the ship that you actually start to understand.
Yeah. Well, so Jeremy, you said you have experienced cultures that validated or prioritized joyful, like you tell a story about that system, would you? Or what were you going to say?
No, I mean, I'm happy to talk about the places where I have worked. None of them perfect, but the places where I've worked where we've been on the other side of that curve, and I work in one of them now. They are places that prioritize humanity. They think of work as a human experience. They prioritize the person, the people that you're working with highly. They prioritize and put systems in place to create space for transparency, so that even when things are difficult, people tend to know, and conversations about what's difficult are okay. They tend to embrace and enjoy failure as an opportunity to learn and improve, as opposed to a just something that means that you're not good, or things aren't going well, or the organization is going to fail. So they tend to fail forward. And all of that is, I feel a little funny talking about that, because all of that feels kind of like it's idealized, and again, none of that's perfect. I can think of examples in the last week when even the experiences that I've had have not always been perfect versions of that. But I think when you point when the magnetic north that your compass is pointing to is that, and you talk about it openly, and you
make mistakes and then come back to the path.
And I think that's another piece of sort of pragmatic advice I'd give to any organization that wants to get more like that, is you have to not stop talking about that stuff. Like, what makes us work well together, that meta conversation has to be part of your practice as an organization. And whether it's quarterly or monthly or even weekly, just having a chance to go, how's everyone doing? Are we who we say we are? I think makes a big difference. I think it makes a huge difference.
Oh my God.
What do you think, Suzanne?
Yeah, that work never ends. And I think I was also thinking about trying to help leaders in this situation, which I believe that there's leadership at every part of the organization. I'm sure you all are with me on that. And in that up power dynamic, there's so much that they have control over. Are we having those monthly check-ins? When an employee says, hey, I want to check in about the culture, it's not the same as the CEO, the founder saying, we're having an offsite once a month, or a 2-hour meeting, whatever. It doesn't have to be long. There's power in a 5-minute check-in. There's power in the way that you start a meeting every time. And I see so often that idealism at the start, right? We're founding a company with a manifesto about people and the human centeredness of this, and 2 years in, and then they get venture funded or whatever. We all know the millions of transitions that can occur. And it reminds me that one of the the experience I've had multiple times is the founder syndrome. I can do everything. I founded, therefore I can build, therefore I can run, therefore I can sell, therefore I can manage. But we all have different roles. And I'm lucky as someone who's made myself a contractor that I get to be mostly I get to be in control of the role that I want to play each day. But if you're founding a company, I think a lot of people forget that that is a particular skill set that lends itself to that audacious moment. And it takes a little bit of crazy, right? to believe that you can launch this thing that's never existed before. And sometimes that audacity comes with some power hungriness that can be toxic later. Not always, but I think it takes a strong level of self-awareness to know, okay, we're past the phase where my audacity is what's getting us started. And now we're in the phase where that audacity actually could be dangerous and could mean that I'm stepping on people, that I'm hurting people. And then those are the moments where it's time to check in. Am I the right person at this moment? I'm a big fan of boards for helping people do that.
So let's think about our listener who might be saying right now, gosh, you guys are describing an environment that I've kind of been living through, where there is a lot of toxicity. I would love to just go around the horn and just in a couple, 3-4 sentences, if that was you, obviously you guys a lot of you have chosen to be on the outside as a contractor, not in this large corporation. But where would you start? Like, what's one thing, if you could say, hey, I know you can't leave right now, but what's one thing you could do to be super proactive or productive in a toxic situation?
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, my first inclination is around discernment. So, because for me, there's so much texture and nuance inside of systems and people who are in fact little microsystems. So discernment first, right? Like where is and I'm also sometimes careful to use toxicity or pathology as language, because a lot of times, like someone could name that my behavior was quote toxic just because I was in a bad mood and I wasn't resourced, and so I acted kind of crappily. So I'm also just just as a human being, I work very hard to make sure that I'm not having a distortion in my perception. Right. Wow. So that's typically my first thing. But then if I do discern, in fact, that there is a deeply dysfunctional situation that I'm in that is going to cause me harm and will cause harm to many other people potentially and is not flexible, then I do try to affirm and validate that reality. So I check my experience with others. Like, is this only happening to me? Is this also happening to you? So I start just gathering data, and information. And then I do start getting real creative about how to approach all kinds of things, because you have to map your passion and your value and your contribution that you can make, right?
Yeah.
And then weigh it against the cost of being in that system. So it's just complex. I guess what I'm really saying is it's complex, and I don't have a strong recommendation other than discernment and alliances with people that care about you, actually care about you. And getting real creative about exit strategies.
Yeah.
As like incrementally and to give yourself a safety net, because you have to at least believe, like physiologically and mentally and emotionally and psychologically, you have to at least believe that there is a way out for you. Otherwise that's painful, really, really painful.
Yeah.
And
there's no hope. Yeah. There's no hope if you don't believe there's a way out.
Even if it's like a year down the road, but you're not trapped, and you're not going to corrode, because that is just awful to be there.
Yeah, I think that reminder that you do have choice, even in what seems like an impossible situation where your paycheck is non-negotiable in 1,000 ways, you do have options, you do have choices. I would say this in a personal relationship as well as a business relationship. You have choices. It might be hard to see them in the moment. And that's why that building alliances, validating one's experience, I think helps maybe move you out of the sort of adrenal response that makes logic go out the window. So fortifying yourself with emotional support, mental, physical support, so that you can then look clearly and start to assess what your choices really are. And also, one small tactical tip is to write things down.
Yeah.
If things are really, if you are doubting, start writing it down. And then in
Yes.
a week or 3 weeks, you see, oh, there have been
No,
there's
pattern.
a pattern, exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
For yourself, and also potentially if that is needed in discussion with others.
Mm-hmm.
It's really good.
Mm-hmm.
Jeremy?
I just want to reiterate, actually, I want to underline some things that I heard that I think are, if I had started, I would have said these things. So it's really nice to have some alignment. I think it was really wise for you all to make the connection between like toxic home experiences, toxic sort of personal life experiences, and toxic work experiences. And I want to just draw on, I think there's a ton of wisdom in recovery programs.
Yeah.
And in particular, that very first step of just acknowledging that there's really a problem.
I have a problem.
And
Yeah.
then
Houston, there's a problem.
Yeah. And then which is sort of a little bit of what you're talking about, Suzanne, in terms of like document this thing for yourself and start to really understand it. And then also in a standard sort of recovery program, another thing that you do is you start to reckon with what you can control and what's out of your control, and you try to stop worrying about the stuff you can't control and only focus on the stuff that you can control. And that wisdom to know the difference is a very, very difficult piece of work, but maybe one of the most important ones. And then the other thing that I'd say, and this is me tapping into, I think, Sonny, you talked about your passion, and I think, as you think about your long term, particularly if you're a young person in a situation like this, as you think about your long term, I think you should be asking yourself, what's the thing that makes me tick? What's the work that makes me feel vibrant and alive?
Yeah.
And not everyone has the luxury to find that space, but I think similarly, we should point ourselves in that direction, even if we can never quite get there. And reckoning with what is the stuff that when I'm finished, I actually feel more energized, not less energized, or I'm exhausted, but I feel great. I feel like I feel like $1 million. That, like, pointing yourself in the direction of getting to that stuff and owning that stuff is good for you. And maybe most importantly, recognizing that working in that kind of space is probably better for everyone else too. Like when you are working in your passion, it's actually better for the world. It's not just good for you. It's like this.
Yeah, it's not
like
just for you.
It has a multiplicative effect. And I think understanding what that is and looking and pointing yourself in that direction is important.
Well said.
All right. I love it. Well, the banging ensues overhead. So sorry if you can hear that, but we're going to close out this segment. And so I want to encourage our listeners, if you are intrigued by this conversation, I would love for you to follow us. You can head over to We Work Forward. You can also find us at weworkforward.co. And of course, check us out on YouTube, the Work Forward podcast. We will have more episodes to come, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining our Work Forward community. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, follow us on LinkedIn, and visit us at workforward.co.
Jeremy, I thought you had a question.
Yeah, I just want to know if you guys have any thoughts about why manholes, the whole world around, are actually round. Why are manholes round?
I'm gonna let Suzanne guess.
I was
Aren't
going to guess.
people round?
That's what I was going to say.
But also, doesn't water flow through round pipes? What would be the alternative is a question I'd also like to discuss.
Triangle.
Well, they tested all those. They tested them
they?
all. Yeah.
I
when they
thought
were-
it was because we are round. Like that was going to be my answer too, especially
Yeah.
like when you put your,
Yeah.
hands over your head, you go in
Yeah.
straight down because you're round. And if it was triangle, we might get stuck. Like I feel like my love handles would get stuck halfway in if it was like triangle.
Like wedged in a corner.
Right.
Yeah. Ooh.
Do
I'm
y'all
sure
want me
there's
to
a
do the
scientific-
big reveal or no?
Please do. Please tell us why.
And I could be wrong, but this is what I learned when I was a kid. So they did test all that. They tested hexagons and octagons and triangles and squares, and like manhole covers were super, super heavy, right? So they didn't want it to be able to drop through the hole. So a circle is the only shape, right? That because a triangle, you can turn it and you can drop it in, you can turn at different angles, but a circle was the most safe in terms of the dropping.
So
And
it's
I
about
remember,
the cover.
yeah.
The
it's
false
about-
question.
Is that true?
Not about
Jeremy?
the whole.
that true, Jeremy?
That's absolutely correct.
I thought so too. I was like,
circle is the only shape that can't fall into its own hole.
yeah.
even an oval can, because you can turn it and then
That's
dump it
right.
down the wide way. So it has to be perfectly round.
But you know what's
anyway.
crazy, Jeremy? The reason y'all are gonna know my true inner nerd. When I was a kid, my mom told me that, and so I was like, "Oh, that's incredible." So then I started proceeding to like prototype the stuff. So I took a can of like Campbell's soup, and then I like cut it out with a can opener, and then I dropped it through the hole. It cut out enough space where it could drop through, but like. The fact that you asked that question, Natalie, is embarrassing because I'm like, oh God, I was such a nerd when I was a kid. Like I remember and care about stuff like that.
I love that you knew that. All right, guys. Well, we are officially out. Have a
That
great
was
day.
awesome.
Thanks, y'all.
Awesome.
See you later.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining our Work Forward community. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, follow us on LinkedIn, and visit us at workforward.co.